A pregnant woman sits in family court, humiliated by her husband's mistress, who is mocking her openly, flashing an engagement ring, whispering cruel insults. The mistress thinks she has already won. The husband thinks his money and power make him untouchable, but they have no idea that Judge Sullivan has been watching every word, every gesture, every lie. And she is about to ask one single question that will flip this entire courtroom upside down. Before we reveal what happens, hit that subscribe button because you will want to follow this story until the very end. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Now, let us go back to the moment everything changed. Rachel Morrison arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before her custody hearing was scheduled to begin. Her sister Rebecca held her arm as they climbed the stone steps, steadying her when Rachel paused to catch her breath. At 7 months pregnant, even simple tasks felt monumental. "You okay?" Rebecca whispered. Rachel nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched a folder containing every piece of evidence she had managed to gather. Bank statements showing Blake had cut off her credit cards, text messages where he ignored her updates about doctor appointments, a voicemail where his voice, cold and distant, said words she would never forget. Maybe this baby was a mistake. They pushed through the heavy doors into the marble lobby. Rachel's phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer, Diane Porter. "Accident on I-95. Running 20 minutes late. Do not let them start without me. Stall if you can." Rachel's stomach dropped. 20 minutes. She typed back a quick response and shoved the phone into her purse. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. "Diane is stuck in traffic. She will be late." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "Then we wait. They cannot start without your lawyer." But as they rounded the corner toward courtroom 3B, Rachel saw him. Blake Morrison stood near the entrance, looking every bit the successful venture capitalist he was. His suit was tailored perfectly. His dark hair was styled with precision. And beside him stood his attorney, James Hewitt, a man known throughout the city as a ruthless litigation specialist who charged $800 an hour. Blake saw Rachel, and his expression shifted into something that might have passed for concern if she did not know him better. He started to approach. "Do not talk to him," Rebecca said firmly. But Blake was already there, his voice low and reasonable. "Rachel, we do not have to do this. We can settle everything today. You can walk away with dignity." Rachel forced herself to look at him. "I am waiting for my attorney." "Your attorney?" Blake's smile was thin. "Diane Porter. I looked her up. Solo practitioner. Handles 20 cases at a time." "Rachel, you are bringing a butter knife to a gunfight." James Hewitt appeared at Blake's shoulder. "Mrs. Morrison, my client is prepared to offer very generous terms. $3,000 per month in child support, visitation rights, and a confidentiality agreement regarding the circumstances of your separation." Rachel's hands tightened on her folder. "Confidentiality agreement? You mean I am not allowed to tell anyone about the affair?" "We prefer to think of it as protecting all parties involved," Hewitt said smoothly, "including the child." Before Rachel could respond, she heard the click of high heels on marble. Vanessa Cole walked toward them, and Rachel felt her breath catch. She had seen photos of Vanessa on Blake's Instagram, carefully cropped to look like professional colleagues, but seeing her in person was different. Vanessa was 28, 4 years younger than Rachel. She wore a navy dress and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. She did not even glance at Rachel as she approached Blake. "The bailiff says they are ready for us," Vanessa said to Blake. Rebecca stepped between them. "Who are you?" Vanessa finally looked at Rachel, and her smile was perfectly pleasant and perfectly cruel. "Vanessa Cole, I am here for moral support." "You are the mistress," Rebecca said flatly. "I am Blake's girlfriend," Vanessa corrected. "The divorce has been in process for 7 months. I am not breaking up any marriage." Rachel found her voice. "I was 2 months pregnant when he moved out." Vanessa's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "That must have been difficult for you. Pregnancy can be so emotionally overwhelming." The words were sympathetic. The tone was poison. The bailiff appeared in the doorway. "Morrison versus Morrison, we are ready." Rachel checked her phone one more time. No response from Diane. She looked at Rebecca, who nodded encouragement. "I need to request a continuance," Rachel said to the bailiff. "My attorney is delayed. The bailiff gestured toward the courtroom. You can request that from the judge. They filed inside. The courtroom was smaller than Rachel had imagined, with wooden benches that smelled of lemon polish and morning coffee. Vanessa sat in the public gallery, 3 rows back. Blake and his attorney took their position at the defendant's table. Rachel and Rebecca sat at the plaintiff's table, and Rachel felt acutely aware of the empty chair beside her where Diane should have been. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered through a side door. She was 58 years old with steel gray hair and sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. Everyone stood. Please be seated, Judge Sullivan said, settling into her chair. She glanced at the papers in front of her, then looked at Rachel. Mrs. Morrison, I notice your attorney is not present. Rachel stood, her voice steadier than she felt. Your Honor, my attorney is delayed due to a traffic accident. I respectfully request a 15-minute continuance. Judge Sullivan checked her watch. 15 minutes. But Mrs. Morrison, if your attorney is not here by 9:30, we will proceed. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor. Court is in recess. The gavel cracked against wood. Rachel sank back into her chair. 15 minutes. She had 15 minutes for Diane to arrive, or she would be facing Blake's high-powered attorney alone at Berthawakis. Rebecca leaned close. You can do this, even if Diane does not make it. You can do this. But Rachel was not looking at her sister. She was watching Vanessa, who had risen from her seat and was walking toward the hallway. As she passed Rachel's table, she paused. You know, Vanessa said quietly, just loud enough for Rachel to hear. Blake told me you always had a martyr complex. That is not good for the baby's stress levels. She held up her left hand, adjusting her purse strap. The diamond on her ring finger caught the fluorescent light. It was enormous. It was new. We are thinking spring wedding, Vanessa continued. Small ceremony. Just family. Rachel felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Engaged. They were in Jen. While she was fighting for custody of their unborn child, Blake had already moved on to planning his next marriage. Vanessa smiled, the expression perfectly pleasant to any observer, perfectly devastating to Rachel. Then she walked out into the hallway, leaving Rachel sitting there with her hand pressed against her pregnant belly, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. Rebecca grabbed her hand. Do not let her see you cry. Do not give her that. Rachel blinked hard, forcing the tears back. But the damage was done. She had walked into this courthouse believing she was prepared. Now she realized she had no idea how bad things were about to get. The 15 minutes passed. Diane did not arrive. At 9:30 exactly, the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. Rachel checked her phone one final time. Still nothing. Her hands shook as she stood. Judge Sullivan looked at the empty chair beside Rachel. Mrs. Morrison, has your attorney arrived? No, Your Honor, but I expect her any moment. The judge's expression was neutral. I granted you a 15-minute continuance. We cannot delay court proceedings indefinitely. Do you wish to request a postponement to another date? Rachel's mind raced. Postponement meant more time, but it also meant more uncertainty, more stress, more nights lying awake wondering what would happen to her baby. And Blake would use that time to build an even stronger case against her. No, Your Honor. I will proceed. Very well. You understand you are representing yourself pro se? Yes, Your Honor. Blake's attorney, James Hewitt, stood immediately. Your Honor, the defendant requests primary physical custody of the minor child, with supervised visitation for the plaintiff. We have substantial evidence regarding the plaintiff's emotional and financial instability. Rachel stood, her legs unsteady. Your Honor, I object to the characterization of instability. I am 7 months pregnant and in excellent health according to my doctor. Judge Sullivan made a note. Mr. Hewitt, please present your evidence. And may I remind everyone that this is a preliminary hearing to establish temporary custody arrangements. Final custody will be determined after full evaluation. Hewitt opened his folder with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. My client, Blake Morrison, is a venture capitalist earning approximately $850,000 annually. He owns a 4-bedroom home in Chevy Chase with excellent schools nearby. He has family in the area to provide support. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Mrs. Morrison, on the other hand, is currently unemployed. She is living in a one-bedroom apartment. She has no family in the immediate area besides her sister, who works full-time. She left her marketing position at Thompson and Associates 7 months ago and has made no effort to seek new employment. Rachel's hands clenched. The way he described it made her sound lazy, irresponsible. He did not mention that Blake had called her boss and told him she was taking indefinite medical leave without asking her first. He did not mention that Blake owned the apartment she was living in and could evict her at any time. "Your Honor," Rachel said, standing again. "May I respond?" "You will have your opportunity, Mrs. Morrison. Let Mr. Hewitt finish." Hewitt continued. "Additionally, Mrs. Morrison has been seeing a therapist for the past 4 months. While we acknowledge that therapy itself is not indicative of instability, the reasons for seeking therapy are relevant. According to Mr. Morrison, his wife has experienced severe mood swings, memory issues, and difficulty making decisions." "That is not true," Rachel said, her voice rising. Judge Sullivan looked at her sharply. "Mrs. Morrison, you will have your turn to speak. Do not interrupt again." Rachel sat down, her face burning. Rebecca squeezed her shoulder, but Rachel barely felt it. Everything was spinning out of control. Hewitt pulled out another document. "I have here a letter from Dr. William Hayes, a clinical psychologist who evaluated Mr. Morrison at our request. Dr. Hayes found my client to demonstrate exemplary parental readiness, emotional stability, and appropriate concern for the child's welfare." He slid the document across to the judge. Dr. Hayes also noted in his evaluation that Mr. Morrison expressed concerns about the stress levels Mrs. Morrison has been experiencing during the pregnancy and whether that stress might be affecting fetal development. Rachel felt like she had been punched in the stomach. They were using her normal pregnancy anxiety against her. They had paid a psychologist to write a report saying Blake was a perfect father while painting her as a danger to her own baby. Judge Sullivan read the document carefully. "Mr. Hewitt, did Dr. Hayes ever interview Mrs. Morrison?" "Note, Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison declined to participate in the evaluation." "Your Honor, I was never asked," Rachel said, standing. The judge looked at her. "Is that true?" "Yes, Your Honor, I received no request to meet with any psychologist." Hewitt's expression did not change. "Your Honor, the request was sent to Miss Morrison's attorney of record, Diane Porter, 6 weeks ago. If Ms. Porter failed to inform her client, that is not our responsibility." Rachel felt her stomach sink. 6 weeks ago was right after she had hired Diane. Had Diane dropped the ball? Or was Hewitt lying? Judge Sullivan made a note. "Somewhat. I see. Ms. Morrison, you now have the floor. What evidence do you have to present?" Rachel stood, gripping her folder. Her hands were shaking so badly that the papers rattled. "Your Honor, I have text messages from Mr. Morrison showing his lack of interest in this pregnancy. He missed every major doctor's appointment. He never asked about my health or the baby's development." She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the messages. "On March 15th, I texted him about our 20-week ultrasound. He did not respond. On April 3rd, I told him we were having a girl. He responded with just the word okay. On May 1st, I informed him about some complications with my blood pressure. He said he was busy." Judge Sullivan gestured for the phone. The bailiff took it and delivered it to the judge, who scrolled through the messages with a neutral expression. "I also have bank statements," Rachel continued, pulling them from her folder. "In January, Mr. Morrison cut off my access to our joint credit cards without warning. I had to ask my sister for money to buy groceries. She handed those over as well." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "And I have a voicemail. Mr. Morrison left it in February." She played it. Blake's voice filled the courtroom, cold and distant. "Rachel, we need to talk about reality here. Maybe this baby was a mistake. Maybe we should consider all our options before it is too late." The courtroom went quiet. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even Hewitt paused. Judge Sullivan's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Morrison, would you like to explain this voicemail?" Blake stood, and for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, that was taken out of context. Rachel and I were having a difficult conversation about the future. I was expressing concerns about the timing of the pregnancy, not about the child itself. You told your pregnant wife that the baby was a mistake," Judge Sullivan said flatly. "I was emotional. I regret those words." The judge made another note. Rachel felt a surge of hope. Maybe Judge Sullivan could see through Blake's act. Maybe she had a chance after all. Then Hewitt stood again. Your Honor, without the court's permission, I would like to introduce a medical expert who can provide context for the emotional dynamics during this pregnancy. Rachel's hope began to crumble. I call Dr. Robert Matthews to the stand, Hewitt announced. A man in his 50s rose from the gallery. He wore a gray suit and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to courtroom testimony. The bailiff swore him in, and Dr. Matthews settled into the witness chair with practiced ease. Dr. Matthews, Hewitt began, please state your credentials for the court. I am a licensed clinical psychologist with 23 years of experience. I specialize in family dynamics, parental fitness evaluations, and high-conflict divorce situations. I have testified as an expert witness in over 200 custody cases. Hewitt nodded approvingly. And have you conducted an evaluation in this case? Yes, I spent 4 hours interviewing Mr. Morrison. I also administered the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the Parenting Stress Index, and conducted a clinical interview using standardized protocols. What were your findings? Dr. Matthews opened a folder. Mr. Morrison presents as emotionally stable, cognitively organized, and genuinely concerned about his child's welfare. His responses on standardized testing showed no indicators of narcissism, manipulation, or emotional instability. In fact, his scores were well within normal ranges across all measures. Rachel wanted to scream. This was the same man who had told her their baby was a mistake, who had cut her off financially, who had sabotaged her job, and this psychologist was describing him as emotionally stable. Did Mr. Morrison express any concerns during your evaluation? Hewitt asked. Yes, he expressed significant worry about Mrs. Morrison's emotional state during the pregnancy. He described mood swings, crying episodes, social withdrawal, and difficulty making routine decisions. He was particularly concerned about her isolation from friends and family. Your Honor, Rachel said, standing, that is because he deliberately isolated me. He told my friends I did not want to see them. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Sullivan said firmly, you will have your chance to cross-examine. Sit down. Rachel sat, trembling with anger and frustration. Hewitt continued, Dr. Matthews, in your professional opinion, do Mr. Morrison's concerns have merit? Based on the clinical picture he described, yes. Pregnancy can create significant emotional challenges. Some women experience depression, anxiety, or stress that can affect judgment and decision-making. Mr. Morrison's concerns appear genuine and appropriate. And in your professional opinion, is Mr. Morrison fit to be a custodial parent? Absolutely. He demonstrates excellent parental readiness. He is financially stable, emotionally mature, and genuinely invested in his child's well-being. Hewitt smiled. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. Judge Sullivan looked at Rachel. Mrs. Morrison, you may cross-examine. Rachel stood slowly. She had no legal training, no experience questioning expert witnesses. But she had something Dr. Matthews did not have: the truth. Dr. Matthews, you spent 4 hours with Mr. Morrison, is that correct? Yes. Did you spend any time with me? No, you declined to participate. I declined, or was I never asked? Rachel pulled out her phone. I have every email my attorney sent me. There is no request for me to meet with you. Can you show me the email where I was asked to participate? Matthews shifted. The request was sent to your attorney. If she did not forward it, so you evaluated a custody situation by talking to only one parent. You heard only his version of events. Is that correct? That is not uncommon when one party declines to participate. But I did not decline. I was never given the option. Rachel's voice grew stronger. You based your entire evaluation on what Mr. Morrison told you, without verifying any of it. Did you speak to my doctor? No. Did you speak to my therapist? Patient confidentiality would prevent that. Did you ask me for permission to speak to my therapist? Matthews paused. No, boss. Did you speak to any of my friends or family members? No. Did you review the bank statements where Miss Morrison cut me off financially? That was not part of my evaluation scope. Did you listen to the voicemail where Mr. Morrison told me our baby was a mistake? I heard Mr. Morrison's explanation of that voicemail in context. His explanation, not mine. Rachel felt her confidence building. Dr. Matthews, how much were you paid for this evaluation? Hewitt stood. Your Honor, Dr. Matthews's fee is irrelevant. I will allow it, Judge Sullivan said. Dr. Matthews, answer the question. $15,000. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Rachel pressed her advantage. $15,000 paid by Mr. Morrison's legal team. Have you done work for Mr. Morrison or his companies before? Dr. Matthews hesitated. I have conducted several employment evaluations for Morrison Ventures over the past 3 years. So Mr. Morrison is a repeat client. He has paid you significant sums of money over several years, and then he paid you $15,000 to write a report that makes him look like an ideal father. Is that accurate? My professional integrity is not compromised by professional relationships. You evaluated a custody case by interviewing only one parent, the parent who is paying you without verifying any of his claims, and you call that professional integrity? Your Honor, Hewitt objected. Mrs. Morrison is arguing rather than questioning. Sustained, Judge Sullivan said, but Rachel could see the judge was paying close attention. Rachel took a breath. Dr. Matthews, you said Mr. Morrison expressed concern about my mood swings and social isolation. Did he tell you why I might be isolated? He said you had withdrawn from friends. Did he tell you that he contacted my friends and told them I was too stressed to see visitors? Did he tell you that he canceled plans I had made without telling me? I evaluated the information provided to me. Exactly. You evaluated his version of reality, not the actual reality. Rachel sat down. No further questions. Judge Sullivan made extensive notes. Dr. Matthews was excused, and he returned to the gallery looking less confident than when he had arrived. But Rachel knew she had only created doubt, not proven her case. Blake still had the financial advantage, the expert witnesses, the appearance of stability. She needed something more. She needed Diane to arrive with the evidence they had discussed. She needed backup. She checked her phone under the table. Still nothing. Your Honor, Hewitt said, standing again. I would like to call a character witness for Mr. Morrison. I call Vanessa Cole. The courtroom stirred with whispers. Rachel's head snapped up. Vanessa stood from her seat in the gallery and walked forward, her heels clicking confidently against the floor. Rachel stood immediately. Your Honor, I object. Miss Cole is my husband's mistress. She has obvious bias and no credible standing as a character witness. Judge Sullivan looked at Vanessa, then at Hewitt. Mr. Hewitt, what is the basis for this witness's testimony? Your Honor, Cole has worked professionally with my client for 3 years as corporate counsel for Morrison Ventures. She can speak to his character, work ethic, and demonstrated concern for family responsibilities. Your Honor, Rachel said, her voice shaking. Calling the woman who destroyed my marriage as a character witness is outrageous. Judge Sullivan tapped her pen. I will allow the testimony, but Ms. Cole, you are under oath. Any bias will be noted, and Mrs. Morrison, you will have full opportunity to cross-examine. Mr. Hewitt, proceed. The bailiff swore Vanessa in. She sat in the witness chair, crossed her ankles elegantly, and looked at Hewitt with calm professionalism. She did not glance at Rachel. Ms. Cole, how long have you known Blake Morrison? 3 years. I was hired as corporate counsel for Morrison Ventures in January 3 years ago. In what capacity have you worked with him? I handle all legal compliance, contract reviews, merger and acquisition paperwork, and corporate governance matters for his company. We work together daily on complex legal issues. Hewitt nodded. Based on your professional interactions, what is your assessment of Mr. Morrison's character? Vanessa's answer was perfectly calibrated. No theatrics, no obvious bias, just calm professionalism. Blake is one of the most principled people I have worked with. He is meticulous about following proper procedures. He cares deeply about doing things correctly, both legally and ethically. Rachel gripped the edge of the table. Vanessa was describing a completely different person. Has Mr. Morrison ever discussed his personal life with you? Occasionally, we are colleagues, and sometimes personal matters arise in conversation. Did he discuss his concerns about his marriage? Yes. Over the past year, he expressed worry about his wife. He said she seemed increasingly unhappy, isolated. He was concerned about her well-being. Rachel wanted to object, but she forced herself to stay silent. Let Vanessa talk. Let her build her story. Then tear it down during cross-examination. When did you learn Mrs. Morrison was pregnant? Blake told me last winter. He was conflicted. He wanted to be excited, but he was worried about bringing a child into an unstable situation. Did he ever discuss leaving the marriage? Not initially. He tried to make it work. He suggested counseling. He tried to be supportive, but the relationship continued to deteriorate. This was a complete fabrication. Blake had never suggested counseling. He had never tried to be supportive. But Vanessa delivered these lies with such smooth confidence that someone who did not know the truth might believe her. When did your relationship with Mr. Morrison become romantic? Hewitt asked. This was the critical question. Rachel leaned forward. After Blake moved out of the marital home, that was approximately 6 months ago. Our friendship evolved into something more once he was no longer living with Rachel. 6 months. Blake had moved out 7 months ago. Vanessa was shaving time off the timeline, trying to make it seem like their relationship started after the separation was already underway. Thank you, Miss Cole. Hewitt sat down with a satisfied expression. Judge Sullivan looked at Rachel. Mrs. Morrison, you may cross-examine. Rachel stood. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. She had evidence. Real evidence. Not expert opinions or character assessments. Hard facts. Miss Cole, you said you have worked at Morrison Ventures for 3 years. Yes? And your relationship with Mr. Morrison became romantic 6 months ago. Approximately, yes. Rachel pulled out a document. Your Honor, may I approach? Judge Sullivan nodded. Rachel handed the judge her phone, showing phone records she had obtained through discovery. These are phone records for Mr. Morrison's mobile phone. They show call and text message frequency with various contacts. Rachel pointed to a specific entry. This number belongs to Ms. Cole. In the month of January, 8 months ago, there were 847 text messages exchanged between Mr. Morrison and Ms. Cole. Does that seem like a normal volume for professional colleagues? The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Vanessa's confident expression flickered. We were working on a major acquisition, Vanessa said quickly. The communication was work-related. 847 messages in 1 month. That is more than 27 messages per day, every single day. Rachel looked at the records, including messages sent at midnight, at 2 a.m., at 6 a.m. on Sunday mornings, all work-related. It was an intense project with international time zones. Rachel pulled out another document. I also have Mr. Morrison's credit card statements. On February 2nd, 5 days before he moved out, while I was 2 months pregnant, he charged $1,500 at Marcel's, one of the most romantic restaurants in Georgetown. The reservation, which I obtained from the restaurant, was for 2 people at a corner table overlooking the canal. Who was your dinner companion that evening? Ms. Cole. Vanessa's jaw tightened. I may have been there. Blake sometimes discussed business over dinner. On Valentine's Day weekend, at a restaurant that does not even have a private dining room for business meetings. Hewitt stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison is speculating about the nature of the dinner. Ms. Cole, Judge Sullivan interjected. Were you at that dinner? Yes, Vanessa admitted. And was it a business dinner? The judge asked. Vanessa hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. We discussed work matters. Yes. Rachel pressed forward. Did Mr. Morrison give you a gift that night? I do not recall. Rachel pulled out another receipt. This is a receipt from Cartier, dated February 2nd, a diamond and platinum bracelet, $3,200. The sales associate noted in the file that it was a Valentine's gift. Is this a normal business gift, Mrs. Cole? The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Hewitt looked uncomfortable. Blake is generous with his team, Vanessa said, but her voice had lost its confidence. Mrs. Cole, I am going to ask you directly. Were you romantically involved with my husband while I was pregnant with his child? No. Are you committing perjury right now? Hewitt shot to his feet. Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison cannot accuse a witness of perjury without evidence. I have evidence, Rachel said. She pulled out her final document. These are hotel receipts from the Watergate Hotel, December 10th through December 12th. That was 9 months ago. Before I was even pregnant, the room was registered to Blake Morrison. But room service was ordered for 2 people every morning. Champagne for 2 every evening. Who was with Mr. Morrison in that hotel room? Miss Cole. Vanessa's face had gone pale. I, that was, you were having an affair with my husband before I even got pregnant. Were you not? No. Then explain the hotel receipts. Explain the text messages. Explain the jewelry. Explain the romantic dinners. Vanessa looked at Blake desperately, but he was staring straight ahead, offering her nothing. Rachel felt a surge of triumph. You sat in this courtroom and lied under oath about when your relationship began. You are not a character witness. You are the other woman who helped destroy my family. Judge Sullivan struck her gavel. Ms. Cole, I remind you that you are under oath. Do you wish to revise your testimony about when your relationship with Mr. Morrison began? Vanessa's voice was barely audible. It may have been earlier than I initially stated. How much earlier? I am not certain of the exact timeline. Judge Sullivan's eyes were ice. Miss Cole, perjury is a serious crime. I am going to ask you one final time. When did your romantic relationship with Mr. Morrison begin? The courtroom held its breath. Vanessa looked at her hands, at Blake, at the floor, anywhere but at the judge. Before the pregnancy, she finally whispered. The gallery erupted in whispers. Blake closed his eyes. Hewitt looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge Sullivan made extensive notes. Ms. Cole, your credibility is now severely compromised. I am noting your perjured testimony for the record. You are excused. Vanessa practically fled from the witness stand back to the gallery. Rachel sat down, her hands shaking but her spirits soaring. She had landed a direct hit. Vanessa's testimony, which was supposed to help Blake, had completely backfired. But as the adrenaline faded, Rachel realized something. She was winning small battles, but Blake still had the money, the expert witnesses, the appearance of stability. She needed more. She needed Diane. Where was Diane? The courtroom doors suddenly burst open. Diane Porter rushed in, her briefcase swinging, her usually neat hair disheveled. She looked frazzled, stressed, and deeply apologetic. Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for my tardiness. There was a multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 95 that blocked all lanes. Ms. Porter, Judge Sullivan interrupted, her voice stern. You are now nearly 2 hours late. Your client has been forced to represent herself through significant testimony. Diane looked at Rachel, horror dawning on her face. I am profoundly sorry, Bikiban. May I have a moment to confer with my client? Judge Sullivan checked her watch. 10 minutes. We will be in recess. The gavel struck. Rachel stood quickly and followed Diane into the hallway, Rebecca close behind them. They found a quiet alcove near the restrooms. Rachel, I am so sorry, Diane said, pulling papers frantically from her briefcase. The accident was catastrophic. 5 cars. I could not get around it. I tried calling, but the cell service was terrible. What has happened? Rachel filled her in rapidly. The psychological evaluation from Dr. Matthews, Vanessa's testimony and subsequent perjury, the text messages and hotel receipts, Blake's voicemail about the baby being a mistake. Diane's expression grew more concerned with each detail. They are systematically building a narrative against you. That psychological evaluation is particularly damaging. It frames Blake as the concerned parent and you as the unstable one. I know. I tried to discredit Dr. Matthews, but I am not a lawyer. I do not know what I am doing. You did better than you think. You caught Vanessa in a lie. That will help. Diane rubbed her temples. But we need something stronger. Something that proves Blake's true intentions. Rachel took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading. She pulled out her phone and played the recording she had made 3 days earlier. Blake's voice echoed in the quiet hallway. Once this is done, we will have full control, supervised visits only, and we document everything. Every time she is late, every emotional outburst, every tiny mistake. Vanessa's voice responded. What if she fights the custody order? Blake again? Then we build the case for full custody, maximum 2 years, and she will be completely out of the picture. Emma will forget she even had a mother who mattered. The recording ended. Diane stared at Rachel. her eyes wide. This is it. This proves everything. This shows Blake is not trying to co-parent. He is trying to eliminate you entirely. Can we use it? Rachel asked. Her voice small. Diane's excitement faded. Where did you make of this recording? In the courthouse. 3 days ago at the pretrial conference, I walked past the stairwell and heard them talking. I recorded it from the hallway. Were you visible to them? Did they know you were there? No, I was around the corner. Diane closed her eyes. Rachel, we are in a two-party consent state. Recording someone without their knowledge is illegal, especially in a courthouse. But it proves the truth. It does not matter. It is inadmissible, and worse. Blake's attorney will use this against you. They will paint you as unethical, willing to break the law, unstable enough to engage in illegal surveillance. Rachel felt the ground drop from beneath her. So we cannot use it. Not only can we not use it, but bringing it up could actually hurt your case. They could press criminal charges against you for illegal wiretapping. Rebecca spoke up. That is insane. She is just trying to protect her baby. I know, Diane said gently. But the law does not care about intentions. It cares about procedures. Rachel felt tears burning in her eyes. Her smoking gun was worse than useless. It was a weapon pointed at herself. What do we do? She whispered. We go back in there and fight with what we have. The text messages, the bank statements, the voicemail, Vanessa's perjury. It is not nothing. Rachel, we can still win this. But Rachel heard the doubt in Diane's voice. They were fighting an uphill battle against an opponent with unlimited resources. They returned to the courtroom. Judge Sullivan resumed her seat. Diane stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, I apologize again for my delay. I am now prepared to continue representing Mrs. Morrison. Very well. Do you have any additional evidence to present? Diane hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then she said, Mrs. Morrison has one more piece of evidence that speaks to Mr. Morrison's true character. Rachel's heart stopped. What was Diane doing? Diane held up her phone. This is a recording made by Mrs. Morrison 3 days ago in this courthouse. In it, Mr. Morrison discusses his actual intentions regarding custody. Hewitt was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, any recording made without my client's consent is inadmissible under state wiretapping laws. Let me hear the basis for admissibility, Judge Sullivan said. Ms. Porter. Your Honor, this recording was made in a public courthouse where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. More importantly, it goes directly to the core issue of this case, what is in the best interest of the child. The stairwell of a courthouse is not a public space. Hewitt countered. It is semi-private, and regardless of location, recording someone without their knowledge violates state law. Mrs. Morrison could face criminal prosecution for this. Judge Sullivan held up her hand. I will hear the recording before ruling on admissibility. Diane played it. Blake's cold voice filled the courtroom, plotting to eliminate Rachel from their daughter's life within 2 years. The impact was immediate. Several people in the gallery gasped. Judge Sullivan's expression hardened. But Rachel could see what was coming. The recording is inadmissible, Judge Sullivan ruled. It was obtained in violation of state wiretapping statutes. Mrs. Morrison, you are fortunate that Mr. Morrison is not pressing charges at this time, but you should be aware that you have potentially committed a crime. Rachel felt the room spinning. Her last hope had just been crushed. Worse than crushed, it had been turned against her. She stood abruptly, tears streaming down her face. I cannot do this anymore. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Sullivan began. He has all the money, all the lawyers, all the expert witnesses who will say whatever he pays them to say. I have nothing. I cannot win. Her voice broke completely. I cannot fight this anymore. She moved toward the courtroom doors. Rebecca jumped up to follow. The bailiff moved to intercept. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Sit down. Something in the judge's tone froze Rachel in place. Sit down right now. Rachel slowly returned to her seat, still crying, her whole body trembling. Judge Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Blake, then at Vanessa in the gallery, then at all the papers spread across her bench. We are not done here, the judge said quietly. In fact, we are just getting started. Judge Sullivan straightened the papers on her bench with deliberate care. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Rachel's quiet sobbing gradually faded as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Before I make any preliminary rulings," Judge Sullivan said, her voice measured and controlled, "I have some questions that need answers." She looked directly at Vanessa in the gallery. "Ms. Cole, please return to the witness stand." Vanessa's eyes widened. "Your Honor, I was already excused. You are still under oath from your previous testimony. Return to the stand." Vanessa stood slowly, her earlier confidence completely gone. She walked to the witness chair and sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "Ms. Cole, you testified earlier that you work as corporate counsel for Morrison Ventures. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you have held that position for 3 years?" "Yes." Judge Sullivan pulled out a document. "According to the employment records submitted during discovery, you were hired in January 3 years ago at an annual salary of $120,000. Is that accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And what is your current salary?" Vanessa hesitated. I would need to check my exact. According to the records, your salary was increased to $190,000 18 months ago. Is that correct?" "Yes." "That is a 58% raise in 18 months. That is quite substantial for a corporate counsel position. What prompted such a significant increase?" Vanessa's face flushed. "I took on additional responsibilities, such as I managed the acquisition of 2 smaller firms. I restructured our compliance protocols." Judge Sullivan made a note. "And when did your romantic relationship with Mr. Morrison begin? Your truthful answer this time, please." Vanessa looked at Blake, who stared straight ahead. "Approximately 18 months ago. The same time you received a 58% raise. Interesting coincidence." The courtroom murmured. Blake shifted uncomfortably. Judge Sullivan continued. "Ms. Cole, in your capacity as a corporate counsel, do you report directly to Mr. Morrison?" "Yes." "So your salary, your job security, your professional advancement, all of these depend on Mr. Morrison's approval." "I suppose that is technically true, but yes or no?" "Ms. Cole, yes." "So when you testified earlier as a character witness, praising Mr. Morrison's integrity and parental readiness, you were testifying about a man who controls your career and your income. Is that correct?" Vanessa's voice was barely audible. "Yes." "And you did not think that constituted a significant conflict of interest?" "I was trying to be honest about what I have observed." "You committed perjury about the timeline of your relationship," Judge Sullivan said sharply. "Your credibility regarding honesty is now 0. The judge turned her attention to Blake. "Mr. Morrison, please stand." Blake stood, his composure visibly cracking for the first time all day. "You submitted employment records during discovery. Those records show that your wife, Rachel Morrison, left her position at Thompson and Associates 7 months ago. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Sullivan pulled out a document. "I have here an email dated January 22nd. It was sent from your personal email address to Marcus Thompson, the managing partner at Thompson and Associates. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Blake's jaw tightened. "That is not necessary." "I believe it is." Judge Sullivan read from the document. "Dear Marcus, I am writing to inform you that my wife Rachel will be taking an indefinite medical leave effective immediately due to complications with her pregnancy. She will not be returning to work for the foreseeable future. Please process her separation accordingly and forward her final paycheck to my attention. Regards, Blake Morrison." The courtroom erupted in whispers. "Mr. Morrison, did you have your wife's permission to send this email?" "She was not in a state to make that decision." "That was not my question. Did you have her permission?" "No." "Did you inform her before sending it?" "No." "So you sabotaged your wife's employment without her knowledge, and now you are using her resulting unemployment as evidence that she is unstable." Hewitt stood. "Your Honor, Morrison was trying to protect his wife during a difficult pregnancy." "Sit down, Mr. Hewitt." Judge Sullivan's voice was ice. "Your client just admitted to interfering with his wife's employment without her consent. I will determine what that means. Not you." She turned back to Blake. "Let us discuss finances. You cut off Mrs. Morrison's access to joint credit cards in January. Is that correct? Yes. Why? She was spending irresponsibly. According to the bank statements, in the month before you cut her off, Mrs. Morrison's credit card charges totaled $863. That included groceries, gas, prenatal vitamins, and one maternity dress. Does that constitute irresponsible spending to you? Blake had no answer. In that same month, you personally charged $42,000 on your private credit card, including $15,000 to Matthews for his psychological evaluation, $3,200 for jewelry for Ms. Cole, $8,000 at a ski resort in Aspen. But your pregnant wife spending $800 on necessities was irresponsible. Judge Sullivan pulled out more documents. You also testified that Mrs. Morrison's one-bedroom apartment is inadequate for raising a child. Who owns that apartment? I do. And who chose for her to live there rather than in the marital home? We mutually agreed. Did you? Because I have an email from your attorney dated February 10th, 3 days after you moved out. It states, and I quote, Mrs. Morrison must vacate the marital residence within 30 days, or Morrison will begin formal eviction proceedings. Does that sound like a mutual agreement to you? Blake said nothing. You forced your pregnant wife out of her home, provided her with inadequate housing, cut off her financial support, sabotaged her employment, and now you are arguing that her resulting financial instability makes her unfit to parent. Am I understanding your position correctly? Your Honor, if I may ask— No, you may not. Judge Sullivan turned to Dr. Matthews, who sat in the gallery looking increasingly uncomfortable. Dr. Matthews, you are still present. The psychologist stood. Yes, Your Honor. Your evaluation of Mr. Morrison cost $15,000. Have you ever been paid by Mr. Morrison or his companies before this case? I have conducted employment evaluations for Morrison Ventures. Yes. How many evaluations? Over the past 3 years, perhaps 12 or 15. At what cost per evaluation? Between $5,000 and $8,000 each. Judge Sullivan did the math aloud. So over 3 years, Mr. Morrison has paid you somewhere between $60,000 and $120,000. And then he paid you another $15,000 for this custody evaluation. You have received close to $100,000 from a man who is now a party in a custody case where you are serving as an expert witness. Did that not strike you as a conflict of interest? I maintained my professional objectivity. You interviewed only Mr. Morrison. You never spoke to Mrs. Morrison. You never spoke to her physician. You never verified any of Mr. Morrison's claims. You took at face value the statements of a man who has paid you nearly $100,000 over 3 years. And you call that objective? Dr. Matthews had no answer. Judge Sullivan was not finished. You stated in your report that you had concerns about maternal stress affecting fetal development. But you never spoke to Ms. Morrison's obstetrician. I have here a letter from Dr. Claire Anderson, Ms. Morrison's physician. Would you like to hear what it says? She did not wait for an answer. Dr. Anderson states that Ms. Morrison has had a completely normal, healthy pregnancy. No complications, no concerns about stress levels. The baby is developing perfectly. Ms. Morrison attends all her appointments, follows all medical advice, and shows no signs of depression or anxiety that would affect the pregnancy. Did Mr. Morrison mention any of that to you? He expressed concerns. He lied to you, and you wrote those lies into an official evaluation that could have cost a mother custody of her child. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Sullivan turned her attention back to Vanessa. Ms. Cole, one final question before you leave my courtroom. Vanessa looked terrified. That engagement ring you are wearing. When did you get engaged? Vanessa's hand instinctively moved to cover the ring. Last month. So 1 month ago, while Mr. Morrison was in the middle of a custody battle with his pregnant wife, he proposed to you. Yes. Did you think that would help or hurt his case? Vanessa had no answer. Judge Sullivan sat back in her chair. Let me be absolutely clear about what I have observed in this courtroom today. This is not a legitimate custody dispute between two parents trying to do what is best for their child. This is a coordinated, systematic campaign of financial and psychological abuse designed to destroy Mrs. Morrison so completely that Mr. Morrison can have total control. She looked directly at Blake. You have lied. You have manipulated evidence. You have paid expert witnesses to rubber stamp your narrative. You have used your financial resources as a weapon. You have sabotaged your wife's career, her housing, her financial security, and now you are trying to take away her child. Blake's face was pale. Hewitt looked stunned. I am not finished, Judge Sullivan said. I still need to make preliminary custody determinations, but I want everyone in this courtroom to understand what I have seen today will weigh very heavily on every decision I make going forward. She struck her gavel. 15-minute recess. When we return, I will issue my preliminary orders. The 15-minute recess felt like hours. Rachel sat in the hallway with Diane and Rebecca, trying to process what had just happened. Judge Sullivan had systematically dismantled Blake's case, exposing every lie, every manipulation, every abuse of power. She sees it, Diane kept saying, almost to herself. She sees exactly what he has been doing. Rachel pressed her hand against her belly. Her daughter was moving. Little kicks that reminded Rachel why she was fighting. What happens now? We find out, Diane said. But Rachel, I have been practicing family law for 16 years. I have never seen a judge take apart a case like that. She is furious. They returned to the courtroom. Blake sat with Hewitt, both men looking shell-shocked. Vanessa had moved to the back corner of the gallery, trying to make herself invisible. Her engagement ring was no longer visible. She had turned it around so only the band showed. Judge Sullivan entered, and everyone stood. When they sat again, the judge wasted no time. I am issuing the following preliminary custody orders, effective immediately. She looked at her notes. First, regarding temporary physical custody, based on all evidence and testimony presented today, primary physical custody is hereby awarded to Rachel Morrison. Rachel felt her knees buckle with relief. Rebecca grabbed her hand hard enough to hurt. Blake Morrison will have supervised visitation rights. 2 visits per week, 2 hours per visit. Supervision will be provided by a court-appointed monitor at Mr. Morrison's expense. The cost of supervision will be paid directly by Mr. Morrison and will not be deducted from child support. Blake's face turned red. Hewitt started to stand, then seemed to think better of it. Second, regarding temporary child support, Mr. Morrison will pay child support in the amount of $8,000 per month, beginning immediately and continuing until further order of this court. $8,000. Rachel had asked for $3,000. The judge had almost tripled it. This amount includes medical expenses, housing, childcare, and other necessary costs for both Mrs. Morrison and the child. Mr. Morrison will also maintain health insurance coverage for both mother and child. Judge Sullivan continued reading. Third, regarding housing, Mr. Morrison will restore Mrs. Morrison's full access to the marital home located at 2847 Brookside Avenue within 48 hours. Mrs. Morrison may choose to reside in that home or may choose to remain in her current apartment, with all rent and utilities for either residence to be paid by Mr. Morrison. Blake's hands were clenched into fists on the table. Fourth, regarding legal fees, Mr. Morrison will pay all of Mrs. Morrison's legal fees incurred in this matter. Ms. Porter, please submit a detailed invoice to the court. I am ordering an immediate payment of $25,000 to Ms. Porter's trust account, with additional fees to be determined as the case progresses. Diane's eyes went wide. $25,000 would allow her to hire investigators, expert witnesses, and put in the time this case needed. Fifth, I am ordering a complete forensic accounting of all marital assets, including Mr. Morrison's business holdings, investment accounts, retirement accounts, and any other assets acquired during the marriage. Mr. Morrison will provide complete access to all financial records within 10 business days. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges. Hewitt whispered urgently to Blake, who shook his head angrily. Sixth, Judge Sullivan said, I am referring several matters for investigation. Mr. Morrison's interference with his wife's employment will be referred to the State Bar Association for investigation into potential tortious interference. Ms. Cole's perjured testimony is being referred to the State Attorney's Office for prosecution consideration. And Dr. Matthews's evaluation will be submitted to the State Psychology Licensing Board for ethics review. Dr. Matthews looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Vanessa was openly crying. Seventh, I am issuing a protective order. Mr. Morrison and Ms. Corso are prohibited from any contact with Mrs. Morrison except through attorneys or during court-supervised visitation. This includes phone calls, emails, text messages, social media contact, or any third-party communication. Any violation will result in immediate contempt charges and potential criminal prosecution for harassment. Judge Sullivan looked up from her papers. Finally, I want to address the recording that was deemed inadmissible. While I cannot consider it as evidence due to how it was obtained, I can say this: Mrs. Morrison's decision to make that recording shows a mother who is terrified that she is losing her child and desperate to prove the truth. That is not the behavior of someone who is unstable. That is the behavior of someone who is fighting for her child against an opponent with vastly superior resources. She turned to Blake. Mr. Morrison, let me be exceptionally clear. Your behavior throughout this case has been reprehensible. You have weaponized your financial advantage. You have lied to this court. You have coordinated with others to present a false narrative. You have used psychological manipulation and financial coercion against your pregnant wife. Blake tried to speak, but Judge Sullivan held up her hand. I have not yet made final custody determinations. That will require a full evaluation, including neutral psychological assessments of both parties, home studies, interviews with family members and friends, and a complete review of all evidence. But I warn you now, if you continue this pattern of behavior, if you violate any of these orders, if you attempt any further manipulation or intimidation, you will deeply regret it. She picked up her gavel. This hearing is adjourned. Preliminary orders are in effect immediately. We will reconvene in 60 days for a full custody hearing. This court is now in recess. The gavel cracked against wood like a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. Then Blake stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Hewitt gathered his papers quickly and followed, his face grim. Vanessa remained in her seat, her face buried in her hands. Rachel sat perfectly still, unable to fully believe what had just happened. She had walked into this courtroom expecting to lose. She had stood alone against Blake's money and lawyers and expert witnesses, and she had won. Not everything, not permanently, but she had won this battle. Diane turned to her with tears in her eyes. You did it. You stood up to him, and you won. The judge did it, Rachel said. She saw through everything. The judge saw the truth because you presented it. You fought back. You did not let them silence you. Rebecca hugged Rachel tightly. You are amazing. Do you know that you are the strongest person I know? Rachel placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter move inside her. We are safe now, she whispered. I promised you we would be safe. They stood to leave. As they walked through the gallery, several people nodded at Rachel with respect. The older woman who had been sitting in the second row reached out and touched Rachel's arm gently. My daughter went through something similar 5 years ago, she said softly. Watching you today gave me hope that things are changing, that judges are finally seeing these cases for what they really are. Thank you for fighting. Rachel nodded, too emotional to speak. In the hallway, they passed Vanessa. She was standing by the water fountain, her mascara running in black streaks down her face. When she saw Rachel, she looked away quickly, ashamed. Rachel paused. Part of her wanted to say something cruel, something that would hurt as much as Vanessa's words had hurt in court. But looking at her now, Rachel felt only pity. You should resign, Rachel said quietly, before the ethics investigation finds what we both know it will find. Well, Vanessa looked at her, surprised that Rachel would speak to her at all. Save yourself the embarrassment. Rachel continued, and Vanessa, the next time you think about helping a married man destroy his pregnant wife, remember how you feel right now. Rachel walked away, leaving Vanessa alone with her regrets. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was warm on Rachel's face. She took a deep breath of fresh air, the first clean breath she had taken in what felt like months. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Shaw from the Washington Post. I was in the courtroom today. I would very much like to speak with you about your case. I think your story could help other women. Rachel stared at the message. The Washington Post, national newspaper. Her story could reach thousands of women going through similar situations. She showed the text to Diane and Rebecca. It is your choice, Diane said. But if you go public, you might face backlash. Blake will be furious. His reputation will suffer. Good, Rachel said firmly. Other women should know what he is capable of. Other women should know they can fight back and win. She typed a response. I am interested. When can we talk? The reply came within seconds. Tomorrow afternoon, I can meet you wherever you are comfortable. Tomorrow works. I will call you. Rachel put her phone away and looked at her sister. Let us go home. Which home? Rebecca asked with a smile. You have two to choose from now. Rachel smiled back. For the first time in months, she had choices. She had power. She had control over her own life. The house, she said. I want to go back to my house. They walked toward the parking garage together. Behind them, the courthouse stood tall against the blue sky, a place where justice had actually been served. Rachel Morrison had entered that courtroom believing she had already lost everything. She walked out knowing she had won something far more important than a custody battle. She had won back her dignity. She had won back her strength. She had won back her belief that truth still mattered. And in 2 months, when her daughter was born, Rachel would tell her this story. She would tell her about the day her mother stood up to power and refused to be silenced. She would tell her that sometimes justice does prevail. 3 weeks after the hearing, Rachel stood in the nursery of the Chevy Chase house, painting the walls a soft yellow. Rebecca was helping her, both of them wearing old t-shirts splattered with paint. You sure about yellow? Rebecca asked. Everyone does pink for girls. Emma is not everyone, Rachel said, carefully edging around the window frame. Besides, yellow is happy, optimistic. That is what I want her room to feel like. The house felt different now. When Blake had lived here, it had been cold, formal, decorated in shades of gray and black that he insisted were sophisticated. Rachel had spent the past 3 weeks gradually transforming it. Colorful throw pillows on the couch, fresh flowers on the dining table, photographs of her family on the walls. It was becoming a home again. Her phone rang. Jennifer Shaw from the Washington Post. Hi, Jennifer, Rachel answered, wiping paint from her hands. Rachel, I wanted to give you a heads up. The article runs tomorrow morning. Front page of the Metro section. The editor thinks it might get picked up nationally. Rachel's stomach fluttered with nervousness. Okay, thank you for letting me know. I sent you the final draft last night. Did you get a chance to read it? Yes, it was perfect. You told the story exactly right. Good. I want you to be prepared. There will probably be some blowback. Blake's attorney has already called my editor 3 times threatening legal action. But our lawyers say we are on solid ground. Everything in the article is documented fact. I am ready, Rachel said, and she was. The article told the truth about financial abuse in custody battles, using Rachel's case as the example of how powerful men manipulated the system. Blake would hate it. His business associates would read it. His clients would read it. Good. After hanging up, Rachel returned to painting. Rebecca had moved on to the second wall. That was the reporter, Rebecca asked. Article runs tomorrow. Front page. You nervous? Terrified, but also relieved. Other women need to hear this. The doorbell rang. Rachel cleaned her paintbrush and went downstairs. Through the front window, she saw Diane's car in the driveway. Come in, Rachel said, opening the door. We are painting the nursery. Want to help? Diane smiled but shook her head. I actually came by to give you an update on the forensic accounting. They sat in the living room. Diane pulled out a folder thick with documents. Rachel, your financial situation is much better than you thought. The forensic accountant found assets Blake never disclosed. Hidden bank accounts, investments in his mother's name, real estate holdings he claimed were business expenses. How much? The marital estate is worth approximately $8.3 million. That means you are entitled to roughly $4 million after division. Rachel stared at her. $4 million, plus ongoing child support, plus your share of his business equity, plus the house. Rachel, you are going to be financially secure for the rest of your life. Rachel felt lightheaded. She had been so focused on just surviving, on keeping custody of Emma, that she had not thought about the actual financial settlement. $4 million meant she could finish her degree. She could start her own business. She could give Emma every opportunity. Blake is going to fight this, she said. Let him fight. Judge Sullivan already ruled that he has to provide complete financial disclosure. If he tries to hide assets now, he will go to jail for contempt. Diane smiled. You have won, Rachel. Not just custody, everything. After Diane left, Rachel sat alone in the living room for a long time, just absorbing the news. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling Emma kick. You are going to have everything I never had, she whispered. Security, options, freedom. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Blake's attorney. Mr. Morrison requests a phone call with you to discuss co-parenting arrangements. Rachel stared at the message. 3 weeks ago, Blake had walked out of that courtroom without a word. Now he wanted to talk, probably because he had seen the forensic accounting report, probably because he realized he was losing everything. She typed back, all communication must go through my attorney, as per the court order. The response came quickly. Mr. Morrison believes direct communication would be beneficial for Emma. Rachel felt a flash of anger. Now he cared about what was beneficial for Emma. Where was that concern when he was cutting off her credit cards, when he was sabotaging her job, when he was calling their baby a mistake? Court order is clear. No direct contact. All communication through attorneys. She blocked the number. Rebecca came downstairs, paint in her hair. Who are you texting? Blake's lawyer. He wants to talk. What did you say? No. Rebecca grinned. Good. Let him beg through the lawyers. Let him know what it feels like to have no control. They ordered pizza for dinner and ate it in the half-painted nursery, sitting on the floor with paper plates. As the sun set, Rachel looked around at the yellow walls, the furniture Rebecca had helped her assemble, the mobile of stars and moons hanging above the crib. This was real. This was happening. She was building a life for herself and her daughter, a life free from Blake's control. You know what the best part is, Rachel said. What? He cannot take this away. He tried everything: money, lawyers, lease, manipulation, and he still lost. He cannot take this away from me. Rebecca raised her water bottle in a toast. To winning. Rachel clinked her bottle against her sister's. To winning. The Washington Post article ran the next morning with the headline, When Money Becomes a Weapon, How Wealthy Men Use Custody Battles to Punish Ex-Wives. Rachel's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. The first call was from her former boss at Thompson & Associates. Rachel, I just read the article. I had no idea Blake lied to me about your medical leave. If you want your job back, thank you, Marcus, but I am going in a different direction. The second call was from a producer at CNN. Mrs. Morrison, we would love to have you on our afternoon show to discuss your case and the broader issue of financial abuse and custody battles. Rachel agreed to the interview. By noon, the article had been shared over 50,000 times on social media. Rachel's inbox was flooded with messages from women sharing their own stories, women who had been cut off financially, women whose husbands had sabotaged their careers, women who were fighting uphill custody battles against men with unlimited resources. One message stood out. It was from Amanda Blake at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Mrs. Morrison, your story is exactly what we have been trying to highlight for years. Would you consider becoming an advocate? We need voices like yours to show other women they are not alone. Rachel called Amanda back within the hour. I want to help, Rachel said, but I do not know what I can offer. I am not a lawyer or a counselor. You are a survivor, Amanda said. You fought back and won. That is what women need to see, not just the horror stories, but the victories. We want you to speak at events, share your story, and help us draft policy recommendations for family court reform. Policy recommendations. Things like mandatory financial disclosure in custody cases, limits on how much parties can spend on expert witnesses, protections against employment sabotage. Your case highlighted all these issues. We need to turn that into actual change. Rachel thought about all the women who had messaged her, all the women who were still fighting. Yes, I will do it. That afternoon, she sat for the CNN interview. The host, a woman named Patricia Winters, was direct and compassionate. Rachel, in the article you describe how your husband cut off your access to money, sabotaged your job, and then used your resulting financial instability as evidence that you were unfit to parent. How did you find the strength to fight back? Rachel touched her belly. My daughter. I kept thinking about what kind of mother I wanted to be for her. Did I want to be someone who gave up, Or someone who stood up for herself even when the odds were impossible? The judge in your case made some extraordinary rulings. She called out your husband's behavior in very strong terms. Do you think that is unusual? I think most judges see through these tactics, but they are constrained by the law. If the law says certain evidence is inadmissible, they cannot consider it. If the law allows parties to spend unlimited money on expert witnesses, judges cannot stop them. That is why we need reform. The interview went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Blake's response came through his attorney, a statement released to the press. Mr. Morrison regrets that his private family matter has been made public. He remains committed to being a good father to his daughter and believes the court system should be allowed to work without media interference. Rachel read the statement and laughed bitterly. Blake was trying to take the high road now. Too late. The next day, she received a letter from Morrison Ventures. Vanessa Cole had resigned, effective immediately. The company was conducting an internal investigation into possible violations of workplace ethics policies. Rachel felt no satisfaction in Vanessa's downfall, just a sad recognition that Vanessa had made her choices and Nish had to live with the consequences. A week after the article ran, Rachel received an invitation to speak at a family law conference in Chicago, then another invitation from a women's rights organization in California, then requests from 3 different universities to guest lecture about financial abuse. You are becoming famous, Rebecca said, scrolling through Twitter where Rachel's case was being discussed by lawyers, activists, and journalists. I do not want to be famous, Rachel said. I want to make a difference. You are doing both. Rachel's phone rang. It was Diane. Have you seen the news? What news? 3 more women have come forward with allegations against Blake. Similar patterns: he dated them while married, cut them off financially when they got pregnant, used custody battles to punish them. One of them is filing a lawsuit. Rachel sat down hard. 3 more. This is bigger than your case, Rachel. Blake has been doing this for years. You are the first one who fought back publicly. Now others are finding their courage. Rachel pressed her hand against her belly. Emma was due in 6 weeks. 6 weeks until Rachel would hold her daughter for the first time. 6 weeks to prepare for a life she had never imagined. A life where she was not just a victim, but a voice, not just a survivor, but an advocate, not just a mother, but a fighter. Good, Rachel said. Let them all come forward. Let everyone see who Blake Morrison really is. After she hung up, she sat in the nursery, now fully painted and decorated. Sunlight streamed through the yellow curtains. The crib was ready. The changing table was stocked. Emma's tiny clothes were washed and folded. Rachel was ready too. Ready to be a mother. Ready to be an advocate. Ready to build a life defined not by what Blake had taken from her, but by what she had won for herself. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. You ruined my life. Blake. He had found a way to contact her despite the protective order, probably using a burner phone. Rachel stared at the message for a long moment. Then she took a screenshot, forwarded it to Diane with a note about the protective order violation, and blocked the number. Blake Morrison did not get to control her narrative anymore. Rachel Morrison was writing her own story now. 8 weeks later, Rachel sat in a hospital room holding Emma Grace Morrison in her arms. Her daughter was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a tiny nose, and dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions. She had arrived 3 days ago after 12 hours of labor, and Rachel had not stopped staring at her since. Rebecca sat in the chair beside the bed, grinning like a proud aunt should. She has your chin and Blake's eyebrows, Rachel said without bitterness. Emma was half Blake, and Rachel would never try to deny that or hide it. But Emma would grow up knowing the truth about both her parents. There was a knock on the door. Diane entered carrying a folder in a small gift bag. How is the most beautiful baby in the world? Diane cooed, peering at Emma. Perfect, sleepy, hungry every 2 hours. Rachel smiled. What brings you here? 2 things. First, a gift. Diane handed over the bag. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with Emma's name and birth date. It is beautiful. Thank you. Second, business. I know this is not the best timing, but I wanted you to know the final custody hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Blake's attorney is asking for a continuance, but Judge Sullivan denied it. What is Blake's argument now? Basically that the media attention has prejudiced the case. He wants a new judge. Will he get one? No, yeah. Judge Sullivan ruled that the media coverage was a direct result of Blake's own actions, and changing judges now would only delay justice. Rachel looked down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully. What do you think will happen? I think Blake will agree to the custody arrangement Judge Sullivan already outlined. Supervised visitation transitioning to regular visitation once he completes parenting classes. You retain primary physical custody. He pays child support. Standard divorce parent arrangement. And if he does not agree, Diane smiled. Then we go back to court, and Judge Sullivan rules against him anyway. He knows he lost. Rachel, his attorney knows he lost. They are just trying to salvage whatever they can. After Diane left, a nurse came in to check on Emma, then a lactation consultant. Then Rebecca went to get coffee, and Rachel was finally alone with her daughter. She looked at Emma's tiny face and felt a wave of fierce protectiveness wash over her. I made you a lot of promises before you were born, Rachel whispered. I promised you would be safe. I promised I would fight for you. I promised you would grow up knowing your mother never gave up. Emma made a small moan in her sleep. I kept those promises, and I am going to keep making new promises now. I promise you will never see your parents use you as a weapon. I promise you will never hear me badmouth your father, even though I have every right to. I promise you will grow up knowing that women do not have to accept abuse. We can fight back. We can win. Rachel's phone buzzed quietly. An email from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They were holding a major fundraising event in New York next month and wanted Rachel to be the keynote speaker. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified by that invitation. Now she felt excited. She had a story to tell, and people wanted to hear it. Another email, this one from a literary agent. I represent several nonfiction authors, and I think your story would make a powerful book. Would you be interested in discussing this further? A book. Rachel had never considered writing a book, but maybe she should. Maybe her story could reach even more women if it was written down, preserved, accessible to anyone who needed it. The door opened again. This time it was Blake. He stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable. He had clearly come straight from work, still wearing a suit. Rachel noticed he had lost weight. He looked older, more tired. I know visiting hours are over, he said, but I wanted to meet her. Rachel's first instinct was to say no, to protect Emma from him. But she forced herself to think rationally. Emma would have a relationship with her father, whether Rachel liked it or not. Better to start establishing boundaries now. You can come in, but this does not count as your supervised visit. That still has to be through the court monitor. Blake nodded and approached slowly. He looked at Emma with an expression Rachel had never seen before. It might have been wonder. It might have been regret. She is beautiful, he said quietly. Yes. Can I? No. Rachel held Emma closer. Not until the custody arrangement is finalized. Not until you complete your parenting classes. Those are the rules. Blake's jaw tightened in, but he nodded. I saw the article, the CNN interview, the speaking invitations. And you are making me look like a monster. Rachel looked at him steadily. I am telling the truth about what you did. If that makes you look like a monster, maybe you should think about why. I never meant to hurt you. You told me our baby was a mistake. You sabotaged my job. You cut off my money. You tried to have me declared an unfit mother. What exactly did you think that would do if not hurt me? Blake looked at the floor. I was angry. I felt trapped. I handled it badly. You handled it abusively. He looked up at that. For a moment, Rachel thought he might argue. Then something shifted in his expression. You are right, he said quietly. I did, and I am sorry. Rachel had imagined this moment many times. The moment when Blake would apologize. She had imagined feeling vindicated, triumphant, victorious. Instead, she just felt tired. Your apology does not change anything. It does not erase what you did. It does not mean I forgive you. I know, but it is a start. If you want to be a real father to Emma, you need to do better. You need to actually change, not just say the right words. Blake nodded. He looked at Emma one more time. I will do better. I promise. Prove it. Rachel adjusted Emma in her arms. Now leave. Visiting hours are over, and Emma needs to sleep. Blake turned to go, then paused at the door. You won, Rachel. You beat me. You can stop fighting now. Rachel smiled without humor. I am not fighting you anymore. Blake, I am fighting for every woman who comes after me. That fight is just beginning. He left without another word. Rebecca returned with coffee and looked around. Did someone just leave? Blake came to see Emma. And you let him? For 2 minutes, supervised by me, on my terms. Rachel took the coffee gratefully. He apologized. Do you believe him? I believe he is sorry he got caught. I believe he is sorry his reputation is damaged. Whether he is actually sorry for what he did to me, time will tell. Emma stirred and began to fuss. Rachel shifted her, and the baby settled against her chest, already learning where comfort could be found. Over the next few weeks, Rachel established a rhythm. Wake up with Emma, feed Emma, change Emma, sleep when Emma slept, and in the brief moments when Emma was content. Rachel worked on her advocacy. She drafted her speech for the fundraising event. She responded to the literary agent with interest. She scheduled 3 more speaking engagements. The custody hearing happened on schedule. Blake's attorney tried one last time to paint Rachel as vindictive, using the media attention as evidence. Judge Sullivan shut him down. Mrs. Morrison went public after experiencing significant abuse. She has every right to tell her story. If Mr. Morrison finds that embarrassing, he should have behaved better. The final ruling was exactly what Diane had predicted. Rachel received primary physical custody. Blake received supervised visitation, transitioning to regular visitation after 6 months of parenting classes. Child support was set at $8,000 per month. The marital estate was divided equally. Blake signed the agreement without protest. There would be no appeal, no further legal battles. It was over.